All right, welcome to the Finance Committee meeting. We are going to begin, after money's done exchanging hands here, with the Pledge of Allegiance. So let's do that. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right. Can I get a motion to approve the minutes from the November 12th meeting?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. So moved. All right, we're going to move on to public comment. In order to meet the requirements of the Sunshine Law, it is necessary to record the names of all citizens who speak to the committee during the meeting. To assure compliance with this requirement, it is essential that those planning to address the committee come to the microphone, state their name and address, and sign the audience of citizens logbook. Members of the audience are asked to limit their questions and comments to allow time for all those who wish to speak to the board. The committee chair may ask an individual to yield the microphone to the next speaker. Seeing nobody who is planning to speak at this time, we're going to move on to items recommended for action and start with the preliminary budget. Is that correct? There we go. All right. Mr. Shigaraki.
Good evening, everyone. Nice to see all of you. I know this is a moment you wait for all year. This is the highlight of your year right here, right? So for our new board members, I apologize. You have to listen to at least an hour of a budget overview. We're going to cover a lot of background information in deference to our new board members tonight, so we do have quite a few slides. I do want to welcome JoJo as our student rep to our meeting tonight. Welcome. JoJo is on the state championship boys soccer team, correct? Yes. Which prevented you from coming to a couple meetings in the past few months, but welcome tonight. We appreciate your time and your input tonight. So tonight we are going to play a little budget Jeopardy. So I will serve as Alex Trebek, and we'll see how successful you are with some of the, remember, everything needs to be in question format only. And tonight's categories are Act 1, yes, but, in and out, not burgers, barometer, potpourri, and now what? Categories are from $200 to $1,000. Okay, who wants to start off? Mr. Fusco is chairperson, right? Okay. You selected category Act 1. So the answer is...
Read my mind.
Thank you for playing along. A property tax relief bill passed by the Pennsylvania legislature in 2006, which sets a cap on the amount a school district can raise property taxes. You're buzzing in, Mr. Fusco.
What
Very
is
good.
the Act 1 index?
Very good. Did you phrase that in question format, though? Okay, all right. You got credit. That was for $1,000. Very good. So Act 1, every school district in Pennsylvania really lives by Act 1, and Act 1 drives our budget timeline. This year is no different. The one difference this year, though, in 2020, we do have a presidential election, which really accelerates the entire budget process. So we finished this preliminary budget, I think, somewhere around December 15th, December 16th, before we left for break. We had it posted online. And again, this is driven by the presidential election, which really necessitates passage of the preliminary budget in January. So tonight is the first look at the budget. It is very preliminary, and as I mentioned in previous years, this is really step 1 of 3. There's a 3-step process to our budget approval process. On January 16th, we'll be asking for your approval of the official preliminary budget, and also for consideration of referendum exceptions. On May 12th, we will have the proposed final budget, step 2 of the process, and on June 18th would be the final step, the adoption of the final budget for 2021. So the Act 1 law that was passed in 2006 comes with that cap that I mentioned earlier. It's called the Act 1 index. It's an inflationary index. It's based on a state component and a federal component, and those two components are averaged together to give you the Act 1 index. So for the 2020-21 year, the Act 1 index is 2.6%, 2.6%. Also, the Independent Fiscal Office in Pennsylvania does further projections out for the next couple of years, for the next 3 years, and they have a 0.2% projected increase for each of the next 3 years. So for the 21-22 years, projected to be 2.8%. and then 3.0%, and then 3.2%. So that's the trend. It's a increasing trend per the projections. And that stands to reason because the the Act 1 index is actually a lagging index. So as the economic conditions improve, it takes a couple years for the Act 1 index to actually catch up to those economic indicators. So the Act 1 index had a high of 4.4%. Actually, it was really at the start of the recession, and then a low of 1.4%.
Mr. Crockett, what is the relationship between the Act 1 index projections and the economy? Is it inverse? If the economy's doing poorly, that should assume to go down?
Direct positive correlation,
Okay.
but about a 2 to 3 year lag. So if you notice, the lowest point of the Act 1 index was 1.4% in 2011-12. That was about 3 years after the recession started. So there's a positive correlation, but it takes a couple years to catch up. The two components, the federal component is basically a wage component at the federal level for K-12 institutions. So when there's layoffs, wages are compressed, they're declining, benefits are declining, so it reduces that number. When job growth is expanding and wages are expanding, that will increase that number. The second component is called the SAW, the statewide average weekly wage. That's a unemployment compensation number, and that's monitored at the state level. So as wages rise, that number rises also.
When I look at this, Steve, I think of it as inflation, plus it's probably retirement costs going into this.
It's an
Act 1 index.
Yep, it's an inflationary.
From the other side.
Yep, definitely an inflationary index, absolutely. Absolutely.
But retirement costs are also built into this also.
Well, at the federal level, it's actually for current employees. It's K-12 current employees. It's a federal measure. It's called the ECI, the Employment Cost Index.
Okay.
So retirement expenses aren't necessarily factored in there unless there's a defined pension plan like Pennsylvania has. In that case, it would be.
Okay.
So if a state offers a defined pension plan, then it would be included.
Okay.
Okay, next category. Mr. Cossett, I hear you buzz in, right? Okay, very good. So a school district that adopts a preliminary budget with real estate taxes that exceed its Act 1 index may seek these.
What is an exception?
Excellent. What are exceptions? Very good. $1,000 and Mr. Casa. So we have a tie, head to head, $1,000, Mr. Fusco, Mr. Casa.
Easy
Excellent.
with this
So-
money. This budget's not balanced yet.
So with Act 1, the Act 1 law has that cap, 2.6% for next year, but then it also gives you a little leeway. If you have certain expenses that are rising higher than that inflationary index, you can apply to the Department of Education, PDE, for what are known as exceptions. So here at North Penn, we are only eligible next year for one exception, actually, and that's special education. The special education exception would generate, if the board would use the entire exception, about $1.8 million rounded. Okay, so again, one of the decision points for January 16th is to seek exceptions. Just because a board seeks and applies for the exceptions doesn't mean you need to use the exception. And in fact, you don't need to use all of the exception. You can seek the exception and decide to use half of it, or $100,000 of it, or the full amount. That's entirely at your discretion. Our recommendation is going to be to apply for the exception. That gives you the latitude at a later point in time to decide if you want to actually use it or not. It's another option in the Budget Balancing Act. So special education, about $1.8 million for next year. And the fact that we're eligible for a special education exception is an indication that our special education costs are rising higher than the Act 1 index. And Kristen Johnson pointed out at a presentation, I guess about 3 months ago, she did what we call a deep dive into our special education costs over the past 10 years. And we're averaging around a 6 to 7% increase in special education over the last 10 years. So it does stand to reason that we would be eligible for an Act 1 exception for special ed next year. The other exception that we were eligible for in previous years was our pension costs, our retirement, PSERS, Pennsylvania School Employee Retirement System. But because the increase in the pension costs next year are so small, we're not actually eligible for any exception for Act 1. Okay, so zero. Last year was a very small amount. I think the eligibility last year was something like $46,000. This year is nothing. So that's actually a good sign. That means the increase in our pension costs next year are not going up as fast as they did in previous years. But the negative side, the downside is that no exception can be considered. There are two other exceptions. I won't go into detail on those, but we are not eligible for those. One is grandfather debt. That doesn't apply here at North Penn. And the other exception would be electoral debt. That is debt incurred via a referendum vote. So those two are not applicable here at North Penn School District at the present time. So special education, that would amount to, if the board would elect to use the entire amount of the special education exception, that would be a 0.97% additional increase in taxes. So if the board elected to use the Act 1 index plus the special ed exception, the total tax increase next year would be 3.57%. So it could be anywhere from 0 to 3.57%. That would be the maximum that would be permitted under Act 1. Assuming that special education would be applied for. So a question they asked would be, well, how have we fared in previous years with the Act 1 index versus what the tax increase has been? So the bar chart here in the yellow shows what the Act 1 index has been back to 2006-07, and the blue is the actual North Penn tax increase. So you'll notice in most years, yellow bar equals blue bar. That means taxes were raised up to the Act 1 index, that inflationary index. One year, there was no tax increase at all. That was in the 2011-12 year. The Act 1 index was somewhere around 1.5%, and there was a 0% tax increase in North Penn. And only 1 year since 2006, that was in the 18-19 year, did the school district actually use Act 1 exceptions. Okay, that was in the 18-19 year. So the blue bar that year is higher than the yellow bar because Act 1 exceptions were used. And in the past year, the 19-20 year, the fiscal year that we're in now, the index was 2.3% and the tax increase was 2.3%. Okay, so in most years, the tax increase has equaled. Okay, Mrs. Stoll, I think I heard you buzz in on the next question. A financial plan based on income, that's the in, and expenses, that's the out, not the burger. So a financial plan based on income and expenses is also known as? Excellent. What is a budget? And you didn't see this presentation ahead of time, did you? Very good. 3 for 3 of our board members tied for 1,000, right? Yes. We'll come up to double jeopardy very soon here. We'll have a playoff. Okay, so what is budget? So I'm going to talk about some of the specifics now for our 2021 budget. And as previous years, we'd like to present the initial budget with a 0% increase and then give you information in terms of a tax increase would generate X amount of tax dollars to try to balance that budget. So the numbers you'll see initially are a little staggering, but keep in mind that's with a 0% tax increase. So our first draft of the budget, preliminary budget, we have a $12.9 million deficit. That means that the outs, the expenses are higher than the ins, the revenue. $12.9 million deficit budget with a 0% tax increase. So to balance the budget, that would require 6.96% tax increase. Well, that's not possible. That's not possible because that would exceed the Act 1 index even using the exception. So 6.96% is not possible. However, I do want to note, attached in board docs is the state form. It's called the PDE 2028. It's a state budget form. It's in board docs. That's the budget document we need to display to the public. In that document, it does show a 6.96% tax increase. And the reason it does is we're actually required to show an increase in excess of Act 1 in order to be eligible to apply for the exceptions. Okay, so we had to show something higher than 6.96. We actually show a balanced budget, but a balanced budget requires a 6.96% increase, which isn't feasible to begin with, but it's necessary to actually include this so we can apply for the exceptions. Okay, just so if you're...
Just a quick question. We had to show higher, you said we had to show higher than a 6.96 or higher than Act 1?
Act 1.
Oh, so not higher than 6. Why so high?
696 would actually give us a balanced budget. That would mean revenues would be equal expenses. And that's always what we strive for, to have a balanced budget that we adopt. So it would take 6.96%, so that's not going to be feasible. So a couple ways of getting to a balanced budget would be to reduce expenditures, would be to raise taxes in part or up to the Act 1 index plus exceptions. So there's a variety of ways, and we'll talk about some of those strategies to get to that balanced budget.
Steve, so 2 questions. back to what Alicia said, doesn't publishing 6.96 seem pretty impactful and just really shocking?
It does.
And then what was the preliminary budget for last year? And was it this high when you actually had to show a number or a percentage higher than Act One?
I think it was a little bit higher last year, actually. I think our first draft of the budget last year was around $14 million deficit.
Right?
So the number
was
was
the
actually
percent?
even higher. Kristen, do you have that? Can you bring that up? Yeah, we'll look that up. I think it was a little bit higher than the 696. Yeah.
Wow.
So you keep in mind, this is the one drawback why communication and a presentation here is so important, because if there could be somebody out there that has, desire to go through that PD 2028 document. They might look for the tax increase, and right away they see, wow, 6.96% increase. They're going to raise my taxes 6.9,
Yeah.
but it's not even possible to raise taxes.
But again, to make the message more accurate, I mean, if you know you can only raise it by Act One, why wouldn't we decide to raise it by a percentage or publish a percentage slightly above Act One as opposed to almost double?
You need to show an increase higher than Act One to even apply for those exceptions. But
I think the other
key.
piece here, though, that maybe perhaps some folks aren't necessarily following is what you're going to see and what you're going to be asked to act on is the projected revenues for the district and the projected expenditures for the district. In order to balance that, you would need a 6.96% increase in taxes. You could reduce the projected expenditures of the budget now. You could. Now, we haven't gotten to that stage of budget cutting, but you could. If you felt like you didn't want to turn it in at 696, you want to turn it in at some number less than that, whatever you would reduce your expenditures by would narrow that gap. So, but we haven't gotten to budget cutting at this juncture.
It's important to note that, again, this is really the first phase of a three-phase process. And every phase that we go through, we produce a new 2028 document for PDE, and we post that for the community. So we kind of view this as tonight as the kickoff for the budget season, because from now until June, we have 4 special Finance Committee meetings dedicated primarily to budget. We have departmental level administrators that are going to be presenting the detail of departmental budgets. We'll be talking about staffing, we'll be talking about debt service, we'll be talking about revenues. Tonight is kind of like the global overview, and then subsequent meetings, we're going to really get into a lot of the detail, of the detail of the
If you
budget.
go to the next slide, the difference between the revenues and expenditures is that $12 million, as Mr. Scrocky had said. In order to generate $12 million and balance it via tax increase, you would need 6.96. We know that by law, we're not permitted to go up that much. But if you chose to, you could reduce those expenditures from $282 million to some number less than that. But that would be, at this juncture, refining the budget more as compared to refining it through the process that Mr. Scrocky talked about earlier.
And I understand and appreciate the iterative process. I guess I'm just shocked that we would actually publicly publish 6.96, knowing full and well that you cannot increase taxes that much, and it only can be as high as the Act 1% is. That's all.
Kristen, what was the
Plus
percentage increase last year?
exception.
I think the idea is kind of just to say roughly 7%. We're 7% at this moment at what we're looking at. What are we going to do to get that number down? Taxes is one piece of that.
Right.
Cost savings is another. There's going to be other factors that play in as well that we're going to find out.
Use of fund balance is another way that you can, pay for your
Yeah.
expenditures.
I mean, I appreciate what the process is, and I understand it. It's just that in my world, if I went into the general manager and said, oh, well, for me to make my budget, I need you to give me another 10%, he'd look at me like I was crazy and walk me out of the room. So I would do the first, let's say, not the fine granular analysis, but I certainly would do a better analysis, getting closer, in this case, to the Act 1 as opposed to.
Is this pretty norm, the norm among other districts? I believe what I've seen, like you kind of start at that point.
You do. Our approach is
I wasn't
typically,
sure. I only asked that question earlier because I guess I thought it was a little bit less last year. I thought it was a little like in between, but obviously I was wrong. It wasn't.
yeah, it was 14 last year for the first draft. And our approach is always, we want to show kind of like the worst-case scenario with the first draft, Our approach the last couple of years has been show kind of the worst-case scenario and then whittle that down through cuts, through refinements, through discussion. You know, one of the problems with developing a budget of this magnitude this early, really 7 months before the fiscal year begins, we're going to talk in a little bit about a lot of the unknowns that we just have we do our best guess in terms of state funding, for example. That'll be refined once we get into February. We do our best guess with staffing. That has still not been fully vetted by our personnel committee. We have a number in there for potential new staffing, but that number could go up, that could go down, depending on our discussions with our personnel committee here. There's a number of other factors, too, that we're using the best information we have right now, and we try to err on the side of being conservative now because we'd rather have a budget presented now that's a worst case and then whittle that down as opposed to start with a much lower number and have it escalate. Kristen, last year, the
It was
tax increase?
7.91.
7.91 is what we showed in that first draft of the PD document.
But then we ended much lower.
We do not have a balanced budget in the current fiscal year. We have about a $7 million deficit in the budgeted current fiscal year. Now, we will end up better than that at the end of the year, but our budget was about a $7 million deficit. And that was assuming use of some fund balance, and that included a 2.3% tax increase in the current year.
And where do you project we'll end?
We're still working on that. We only have 5 months' worth of data analyzed for the end of the year projections. So we're a little bit worried about some of the revenues. The revenues aren't coming in quite as robust as they did in previous years, in particular the income from investments. Expenditures are going to come in under budget again. So I would say right now, maybe a $3 to $4 million positive variance. That would still mean use of fund balance of about $3 million. And we'll talk about fund balance, what that means. Those are our reserves. We'll talk about that in more detail. But $282 million is our expenditure budget for the first draft of the budget for next year. That's a 3.11% increase over the current year. So again, a $6.7 million deficit is our board-approved budget for the 19-20 year. So our deficit, first draft of the budget, actually is increasing by a little bit over $6 million. On the revenue side, this continues to be somewhat of an issue that our revenue growth, absent a tax increase, once again, is only 0.91%. So this is our, call it your organic growth, just with new properties coming onto the rolls, increased earned income tax, increase in the projected state subsidy. 0.91% is really small, and clearly it's only a third of what our expenditure growth is, not a sustainable formula. Okay. One of the things we like to do too is with the $8.5 million increase in our overall expenditures, we like to pull out some of the big ticket items that lead up to that $8.5 million. So some of these are very common and are on the list every year. So for example, salaries and pension are on the list this year. They've been on the list every year. So contracted salary increases are increasing $3.9 million, but that does include a placeholder for 22 new positions. I mentioned earlier that we've had some preliminary conversation with our personnel committee. We'll have another conversation about staffing tomorrow night with our personnel committee. But for the present time, we have 22 new positions in there, and that equated to, I think it was roughly $1.6 million net of the state subsidy in terms of an increase to the budget. I think it was about 1.7, 1.8 on the expenditure side. Then we do get some subsidy back for Social Security and retirement. So we had talked about that a little bit with our personnel committee last month. So these are our positions that are undefined at this point, but they're merely placeholders in the budget. So if our personnel committee would say no new positions next year, approximately $1.5, $1.6 million could come out of the budget. PSERS, $1.7 million increase. That's a pretty low increase compared to previous years. We do get 1/2 of that back from the state in terms of the retirement subsidy. Special ed legal settlements, we're projecting a $1 million increase based on settlements that are already in the pipeline plus new settlements for next year. As we get closer to the end of the fiscal year, that number will be refined as well. Textbook replacements, we'll hear about this more when we have the Department of Curriculum present their departmental budget, but $500,000 increase there. Technology security assessment, $290,000, and charter school tuition, $475,000. I'm going to talk about charter schools in a moment. But if you add up those items, those 6 items, that equates to $7.9 million, which almost covers the entire $8.5 million expenditure increase for next year. And again, the Act 1 index at 2.6% would generate about $4.8 million rounded off. So even with the full Act 1 increase, it doesn't come close to covering the total expenditure increase.
Mr. Scrocky? I have a question, maybe you'll address this, sorry, the charter school tuition. That's what stood out to me. Is that alternative placements or simply charter school?
Simply charter school, brick and mortar, and cybers, yes. I do want to spend a couple minutes on that. I have a couple slides on that. But that continues to be an escalating cost for the school district. Many would call it an unfunded mandate. We used to receive a subsidy for that. We no longer receive a subsidy for that, and we really have little control, in fact, no control over the amount of money once a parent decides to place his or her student in a charter or a cyber school. So I want to talk about the breakdown of that $280 million now. If we simply categorize the budget, $280 million, into 3 pieces of the pie, the largest portion comes from salary and benefits. This should have been a Jeopardy question. This is an easy one. This is a softball here. 78% of our budget is salary and benefits. So it's people. It's people. So many times when a district looks to make cuts, unfortunately, to make the largest cuts, if you have a significant amount of money to cut, personnel costs, since it represents the largest share of the budget, many times that's the easiest place to look towards. Debt service represents about 5% of our budget, and that's pretty low. That's roughly half of what a lot of peer districts are at. 8 to 10% is more common. We're at 5%. So our debt service is actually pretty low. And throw everything else in. Everything else would be supplies, textbooks, professional services, transportation, the buses, fuel, energy, lights, electricity, insurance. Everything else represents 17%. So out of that 17%, everything is not variable in that 17%. So you couldn't say, well, let's cut into that 17%. I want 90% of that 17% cut. That's not feasible because there are many fixed costs that are part of that 17%. So for example, once you make a decision to provide transportation, you have busing costs. We contract some of our busing, you have in-house busing costs, you have fuel expenses and so forth. If you said we're not going to provide transportation, then I would say, okay, now our transportation budget is $14 million in total. Now that becomes a variable cost. But the minute we decide to provide transportation, that $14 million to a large degree is a fixed cost. One of the things that we try to drive prices down each year are purchase of fuel that's competitively bid, and we pay close attention to the futures market for oil and try to buy our diesel fuel at the appropriate time. Our propane now is under bid. That's under contract for the next 2 years. Constantly looking for grant proceeds. We've been very successful in transportation with our propane grants. But the point with this is that 17% is not all variable. A lot of that is a fixed cost. You have to turn on the lights, you have to heat the building, you have to air condition the building, whatever the case might be. So this is one of my favorite charts. I beat it to death every year, but when we look at the growth of our retirement rate since 2000, in the last 20 years, it's absolutely staggering. And unfortunately, there's no relief on the horizon. PCERS put out a projection for the next 5 years, and the rate is going to hover somewhere around 38% over the next 5 years. We're in the 36% range right now. It'll go up to about 38% and pretty much stay there for a long period of time. So it means for next year, we're paying roughly almost 37 cents of every dollar that an employee earns into the pension system. Now, we do get half of that back in the form of a subsidy, but 37 cents compared to the year 2000 when it was about 1 cent. So 1 cent to 37 cents over 20 years, it's unbelievable the amount of money that has been generated, not just by North Penn School District. Our magnitude is much larger simply because we have a bigger budget. But the same story holds true for every school district throughout the Commonwealth. Now, the fortunate thing is we've weathered the storm now, okay? We've reached the highest level. We're within 2% of what the highest level is going to be. So we've weathered the storm, we've sustained it. That's the good news. So our retirement increase for next year, what was it in the earlier slide? $1.7 million. That's the lowest it's been in about 10 years. Mr. Resch, you had a question?
And when
Yes, that's included in the benefits. Yes,
It's not in the salaries, it's all in the
in the benefits, correct. Yep.
And that's why our benefits are like 60% of salary at this point.
There,
It should be closer to 30%.
right, it continues to
So
grow.
If you're looking at it, about 30% of our benefits, about half of our benefit costs go to retirement.
Right.
benefits.
Yep. So in terms of total dollars here at North Penn School District, going back 10 years, we paid into the pension fund about $6 million in pension costs. And next year, we're going to be paying about $47 million. $6 million to $47 million in 10 years. So what do you think we could do with that extra $41 million? What do you think we could do that annually in our budget? If we rewound the clock back to 2010 and we're able to use those pension rates and freed up, around $40 million, I think we could do a lot with that money, when we talk about some of our long-term plans with infrastructure and things like that. But it's absolutely staggering once again. I do like to coin the quote that we had a number of years ago from a former governor. He said that the retirement expense is a tapeworm eating into school district's budget. It's true. We've reached that plateau. We're going to stay at that plateau. The good news, again, we're not seeing double-digit increases every year like we did in previous years, but still, it's such a significant amount of our budget. And back in 2010, it was less than 4% of our total budget, and now it's 15% of our budget. So basically, our retirement expenses have quadrupled in a mere 10 years. That's a pretty incredible rate of return in a 10-year period when you have a four-bagger with your retirement expenses. So I mentioned earlier about charter tuition school rates and what our expenses are and so forth. So I want to take a look at our rates over the past 5 years. We have two different rates, and there's a formula that actually calculates these rates. And these are the rates that we pay anytime a student goes to a brick-and-mortar charter school or a cyber school. So if the student has an IEP, a special education student, we're paying about $34,000 per year for that one student in the 1920 year. And for a regular education student, it's roughly $15,000. So that's the bad news. The good news, for a district our size, we have almost 13,000 students that attend North Penn schools. We have only about 135 students in charter schools. That's a pretty low number for a district our size. You have some school districts where 20, 30, 40% of their entire enrollment go to a charter school. They're paying tens of millions of dollars, those schools, to charter schools. So here, I think it's a testament to the quality of education here at North Penn School District. Parents can vote with their feet and send their students to a charter school if they so choose. To have 135 students out of 13,000 is a pretty low number. Nonetheless, it's a mandated expense that we need to incur, and in our budget for next year, we're going to be paying almost $2.7 million in charter expenses. So even though it's only 135 students, $2.7 million, it doesn't necessarily enhance the instruction here at North Penn School District. It's just money that's flowing out to charter schools. And some have raised issues with charter schools, how they're funded. Governor Wolf had made some attempts to reform some of the charter school funding with little success to date. There's some concern with the amount of money that's being spent by some of the charter schools on advertising. In fact, I heard an ad just coming back from dinner tonight on Sports Talk 94 WIP. There was an ad for a cyber school. And guess who paid for that ad? You did. I did. The taxpayers did. So anytime we send that $14,000 or $32,000 to a charter school, they're using that money to advertise, paid advertisement, to attract more students. So it just doesn't seem fair. And equity is one of the major issues that Governor Wolf brought up to try to level the playing field between public school districts and charter schools. Well, in the eyes of the law, a charter school is a public school, but to have the same accountability standards, charter schools don't have elected boards like public schools do. So again, accountability and transparency are some of the issues that Governor Wolf is trying to address. On this chart, there's two blue bars back in 2009 and 2010, and that represents a subsidy we actually received. Way back in 10 years ago, we had received a subsidy equal to roughly 30% of the charter school expenses, Now it's zero. That was eliminated by Governor Corbett at the height of the recession in 11-12. It was never restored again. So again, an unfunded, mandated expense that we have no control over, and now we get no subsidy. So it continues to be a drain on the school district's budget. We have no say in the matter other than to continue to provide a quality education here at North Penn to try to keep the numbers as low as possible. Another way of breaking down our budget is by an accounting term called function. And there's really four major functions of spending: instruction, support services, non-instructional support, and other expenses and financing. And it stands to reason that the largest portion of our pie, our spending pie, 63%, is for instructional purposes. 29% support services, 1% non-instructional support. Those are student activities and athletics, and 6% other expenditures and financing. That would be debt and budgetary reserve and budget transfers into capital reserve. Our revenue next year with a 0% tax increase, $269 million. 68% of that revenue comes from real estate taxes. That's a pretty large number. 21% comes from state sources. So when you look at the state sources versus local sources, it's roughly 79% local, 21% state. So we have a higher reliance here in North Penn School District on local sources, real estate taxes, earned income tax, realty transfer tax, than a lot of other school districts. A lot of districts, the mix is maybe something like 1/3 from the state, 33% from the state, and 2/3 local. Here it's skewed more towards local sources. And our local sources comprise primarily four big ticket items: our real estate taxes and our interim taxes, our earned income tax, our transfer tax, and our delinquent tax. Those are the big four. Besides real estate taxes, earned income tax is our second biggest local revenue. It's over $18 million next year in next year's budget. The earned income tax is the 1% tax, the EIT tax, the 1% wage tax that you have deducted from your paycheck. Half of that 1% comes to North Penn, the other half goes to the municipality in which you live. Another big component, since we have such a reliance on local real estate taxes, something we really pay monthly attention to, is our tax base. That's basically taking the assessed value of every property in North Penn School District and adding it up, whether it's a commercial property, a residential property, industrial property. If you add up all the properties, add up the assessed value, that equals our total tax base. And we're almost at $7.3 billion for the upcoming year. It's something we really pay attention to because if you have a fast increasing tax base, you could have a 0% tax increase and still generate additional tax dollars with a 0% increase as long as your tax base is growing. Now, historically, over the past 10 years, our tax base has increased by about 0.5%. That's actually pretty healthy, 0.5%. The last couple of years, though, it's been tapering off a little bit, and next year is no exception. Next year, we're looking at about a 0.22% increase right now in our tax base. This is another item that we monitor monthly and update monthly as part of the budget process. If new properties come onto our rolls with increased assessments, we will update these figures and reflect that additional revenue that's generated. But right now, our assessed value for next year is going up only $15.7 million. That would represent a 0.22% increase. Again, half of what the average has been. That would mean with a 0% tax increase, the tax base would generate $399,867 in new revenue just because of the tax base increase. That's a pretty small number, pretty small number. We're accustomed to typically something over $700,000, somewhere in that range. Okay, our state revenue, again, that's about 21% of our total budget. The three big state revenue items are, number one, retirement. 42% of all of our state subsidy comes in the form of a retirement subsidy. So everything we pay out in retirement, we get half of that back from the state. So years ago, retirement subsidy was about the third largest piece of state funding. Now it's the largest. And that means one thing, that we're spending a heck of a lot more money in retirement. So 42% of all state funding comes from the retirement subsidy. The next biggest item is our basic education funding subsidy, the BEF. That's 20%, that's in blue. Next largest is our special education subsidy, that's 12%. So we had to make some assumptions with respect to our basic ed funding and special ed funding for the upcoming year. Those numbers aren't released until the governor's budget address in early February. I think the date this year is February 4th. It's usually the first Tuesday in February. It actually might be later this year because of the presidential election year. It might be a week or two later. I'll have to double check on that. But that's another example. When we have those numbers, we'll reflect that in the budget. But we made some assumptions with those, the basic ed and the special ed for next year. Okay, mentioned briefly about our fund balance. Dr. Dietrich said that's another mechanism by which a budget could be balanced. We have 4 different pieces of fund balance. Fund balance is our reserve, our rainy day fund, retained earnings, a number of ways to refer to it. The official term in PD's eyes is the fund balance. So our fund balance as of June 30, 2019, based on our audited financial statements, those 4 components include non-spendable fund balance, that's inventory and prepaid items, $343,000. We have $2.7 million assigned for our self-insurance. We are self-insured for our medical and prescription coverage and our dental coverage. So we have $2.7 million set aside for that. We have $16.8 million committed for pension, and that was committed via board resolution. And that's something I'd actually like to revisit this year, because now that we've reached a plateau for PSERS, I think we can have some conversation about possibly committing some of those dollars elsewhere. And that can be done by simply passing a new resolution. I just don't think 16.8 is necessary when we have only a $1.7 million increase next year in our retirement expense. And then unassigned, this is a piece of our fund balance that's not designated for any particular purpose that could be used to help bridge the budget deficit this fiscal year, for example. It's $21.2 million. And the reason I have that percentage in there, 7.76%, it's important to note that our maximum unassigned fund balance can only be 8% or less based on the size of our district. We can't exceed 8%. Okay, cannot exceed 8%. Okay, so total all in, our fund balance is $41 million. I know I get asked this question every year, what's a good level of fund balance? I really believe the $41 million right now is a sweet spot, because you have to be careful. You don't want to have too much in reserve. The perception could be that you're holding on to our tax dollars. Why do you need to have $41 million in reserve? We also know how important that fund balance is when it comes time to do a borrowing, a bond issue, because the first question that the rating agencies have is how much money you have in reserve in your bank, $41 million. And the one thing that prevented North Penn from a AAA bond rating this past year is we weren't quite at the level of fund balance as some of the other districts that have a AAA bond rating. Okay, so some of the districts, like a Westchester, like a Downingtown, they have $20 to $30 million in additional fund balance than what we do. But again, in terms of a sweet spot, what I think an ideal, not too hot, not too warm, the Goldilocks economy, the Goldilocks fund balance, I think we're right there. I think it's a very good number. So you have to be careful, though, that when you start using fund balance to balance the budget, it's basically using your savings account to pay for ongoing household expenses. And at some point, when you use up your savings, then you're in trouble. How do you pay your ongoing bills if you no longer have savings? So that's why it's important to have a fund balance that's not too hot, not too cold, and you're not using it too aggressively.
So for context, and see if you can pull this number out. This time last year for the preliminary budget presentation, the total fund balance was approximately what? Like,
Right around
where we're at right now.
I think we added $300,000 to the fund balance this past year because we did make a capital reserve transfer. So let's, right around 41 million.
Okay.
Yep.
Good.
Okay. Jeopardy question, another one. So who can I pick on this time? Mrs. G. Okay, I hear you buzz in, Mrs. G. I see your microphone lit. You buzzed in. Okay. This is a tough one. So, answer is. No, this isn't. What's that called? The Millionaire Show?
Phone is super.
Yeah, phone is super.
All right, there you go.
All right, the practice of comparing performance metrics to industry best.
Call Kurt Dietrich, please.
Alex, what is benchmarking?
Wow, excellent.
That
There you
seems
go. For 1,000. Way to
It's a
go.
one-word answer. It seems like I should have known that.
Sorry you didn't hear me. That's what I said.
Just remember, Mr. Fusco called you out. You remember that, okay?
I'll get it later.
I love it. IGYL, I'll get you later. Some quick performance metrics, and I do want to mention that Kristen did some of these with special education. Deep dive into our performance metrics and comparisons, not only to Montgomery County IU districts, but to what we consider our peer school districts. I mentioned two of them earlier, Downingtown and Westchester. We consider Central Bucks a peer district, maybe to a lesser degree Council Rock, based on the size of enrollment, based on the size of the budget. Tonight I'm just going to show a couple quick snapshots of MCIU comparisons. Kristen, in the coming months, I think in February we have a deep dive with facilities. We're going to do benchmarking with facilities, and then we're going to get into other departments. Beyond the scope of tonight, just want to hit a couple though. No one likes taxes. I like to look at taxes relative to how we're faring compared to our peers. In North Penn School District, we are the 5th lowest in the county, and we are 18% below the county average. Not bad, not bad. I'll take that position as opposed to being the 5th highest, 18% above. So this is a pretty good metric. Cheltenham.
And what is there?
Oh, boy, over 40 mills? Kristen could probably look that up. We're at 26 and change, and I think they're over 40. And they've been the highest for the last 10 years, every year for the last 10 years. North Penn has hovered right around the 5th lowest spot for 10 years. Another metric that I like is we are in rare air company when it comes to our bond rating. We have a AA1 bond rating. I mentioned that earlier, that we just missed a AAA by a hair this most recent go-around, but there's only 19 school districts in the state of Pennsylvania that have a AA rating or higher. So I think that speaks very highly to the board's commitment to its financials and maintaining that fund balance. So that's a great metric position to be in. A couple other quick ones. Per pupil expenses. This is the last data that's available, the 2017-18 year. North Penn compared to Montgomery County IU school districts. We're at a little bit over 20,000, whereas the IU average is 22,619. So we are ranked 17th out of 21, meaning our spending is 17th highest out of 21. So we're towards the bottom. So don't worry that we're not spending enough relative to our peers, because we talked about what the sweet spot is. When you have a high-achieving, high-performing, high-scoring school district that spends less than the average, that's exactly where you want to be. That's called ROI, that's called bang for your buck, and that's exactly where we're at here at North Penn School District. So that's why I show this, not that, oh, well, we need to spend more because we're spending less than our peers. Is no, we're spending less, we're delivering high performance with student performance while spending less dollars than our peers here in Montgomery County. And breaking that down a little bit further into just the instructional expense. They call that the 1100 function in accounting. But again, we're more towards the middle here. We're ranked 12th out of 21, but again, we're below the IU average. The one area that we're more right near the average, a little bit above the average, is special education expense. And that's one of the items that Kristen took a deep dive into back in October, I believe it was, where our special education spending really is growing at a pace of 6-7%. That's much, much higher than what the Act 1 index is. Okay, so we're coming up near the end of Jeopardy. We'll have final Jeopardy in a moment. But a couple quick highlights of the budget. There's always some good things with the budget, some bad things with the budget. I like the good things when we're shedding expenses that we had in the previous year. We are approaching now, the 1920 year is the very last year of any lease payments that we have. Last year, we shed our last technology lease. This year, we're shedding our last transportation lease. Years ago, we leased some buses and we leased some technology equipment. Now we fund those as part of the general fund budget in cash. There's a $97,000 bus lease that comes out. Also, the numbers I presented with a $12 million deficit does not include any retirements at this point in time. It's another example. As we receive new information, we will constantly update the budget. I can tell you that some districts kind of bank that money and don't reflect it in the budget. When they get to the final budget, they know they have money in their back pocket throughout the year. We don't take that approach. When we have a retirement, we reflect it in the budget. And history shows us that we are able to generate through retirements about $1 million in salary and benefit expense each year. So I'll show you what that means in terms of impact, where we think we'll be at the end of the year in a moment, but about $1 million. And I mentioned about the retirement rate. The fact that we only have a 0.64% increase in retirement this coming year, I was jumping for joy. That is such a small increase. Really pleased that it's so low. Another piece we have on the agenda tonight, so I'll steal some of the thunder, but our first look healthcare rates, again, we're self-funded, so a lot of our rate information is driven based on our experience, what our claims have been the past 2 years, and what the trends are. And our first look numbers, which tend to be the highest numbers, are actually a big fat goose egg, a 0% increase in healthcare for the upcoming year. So I think this is a reflection. It could be some luck. Sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. We'll take it. Another is a reflection on some of the plan design changes that were made as recent as the last labor negotiations that we had with our association. So I think a combination of the two, we're really fortunate that we're going to have a 0% increase for the second year in a row in our medical rates for the upcoming year. We're also projecting some decent growth in our earned income tax and transfer tax. We've actually increased the budget by $781,000 for those two line items. So that certainly helps with the revenue also. A couple of the unknowns. I mentioned about basic ed funding won't be known until the governor's budget address. We put in a 3% increase in basic ed and a 2.6% increase for special ed. Federal funding, we put in a flat amount for the upcoming year. Again, as we have more information on that, we'll update things. Retirements, I just mentioned, and staffing changes. That really goes back to what I spoke of earlier about the possibility of new staffing positions to provide additional supports in key areas throughout the district. So I want to run through a scenario that we started showing last year, hypothetically what the situation could look like, because when you hear, one of the first slides was, you have a $12.8 million deficit next year. I mean, it's kind of alarming and staggering, but let's try to put things in perspective. And I'm not necessarily recommending any of these, just throwing these out there, what it potentially could look like. So let's start out with a minus $12.8 million. And again, just for the sake of math here, let's assume an Act 1 increase that generates $4.8 million roughly. Special ed exception would generate $1.8 million. We anticipate shedding another $1 million from the budget for retirement. We have $1.5 million in the budget for budgetary reserve, and that's per board policy. And budgetary reserve is basically a line item in the budget for unexpected expenses that might come up throughout the year. So our goal every year is not to touch that at all. That's always our goal. Now, unfortunately, some years we do eat into that. But if we don't eat into that next year, if there are no unplanned expenses, that $1.5 million basically flows back down to the bottom line. And each year, too, we try to be conservative with our budget. You've heard me say many times that the budget is getting tighter and tighter. Our variances are getting smaller and smaller. But if we assume a positive variance, meaning we'll bring in 0.5% more in revenue and we'll spend 0.5% less in expenses, that would generate $2.7 million. So if you assume all these things, throw everything into the pot, at the end of the year, you would use $1 million in fund balance. Now, I think the $1 million is very reasonable. It's not a large draw in fund balance, but that makes the assumption that all those items above it would be implemented. So let's say, for example, the special education exception is off the table. That would mean roughly $2.8 million in fund balance would be used next year. I get concerned when we start looking at end-of-year use of fund balance, $4, $5, $6 million. That's a hefty number. Now you're looking at using up 10% of the fund balance in 1 year, and that tends to have the snowball effect. You use 10% 1 year, and now you're starting out with a big hole again the next year. You might use 10% the next year. In 5, 6 years, before you know it, you're almost out of fund balance. So you have to be really careful. $1 million in fund balance use, I won't lose sleep over. $5 million, $4 million end of the year, I definitely would be a concern of mine. So we're projecting this year, we're hopeful to go through this fiscal year, maybe walk away with a $3 million, maybe a $4 million use of fund balance. If everything is implemented here, as things stand today, we'd have a $1 million use of fund balance at the end of the fiscal year. Questions about that? Okay. 2 quick slides on the variances. These are since 2014-15 to give you an idea. We've been pretty good with trying to come as close to budget as possible. I know Dr. Dietrich likes to mention, like last year, for example, we had a little bit over a 1% variance, so it's like scoring a 99% on a test. You got 99% accuracy, that's pretty good on the expenditure side. And revenues, pretty similar story. We had one spike in 2016-17, and that was due to a large number of assessment appeal settlements to our favor. We got a big influx of money that year, which inflated the variances that particular year. But every year there, we try to get around 1% as our goal, to try to get it as tight as possible. We also like to show the tax scenarios under varying tax increase proposals. So, for example, with a 0% tax increase where things stand right now, that would mean the average homeowner would not see any increase in taxes, but we would have a $12.8 million deficit. At a 2.6% Act 1 index increase, for example, we would still have at that point an $8 million deficit, and the average homestead would see a $100 increase. And the last one I put in simply because that's the Act 1 increase plus a special ed exception, that equals 3.57%. At 3.57%, it will be a $138 average homestead increase. That would leave us with a $6.2 million deficit. The average homestead, I want to clarify that would be a residential property, and the median assessed value is $147,000. That's not fair market value. You're not taxed on fair market value. You're taxed on assessed value. So the median assessed value for homesteads in North Penn School District is roughly $147,000. So what's the fair market value for a $147,000 property? You basically double it. The common level ratio is right around 50%, so that means you take the assessed value and double it, and theoretically, that's what you could receive in the fair market if you tried to sell your house. So if you have a $147,000 assessment, you're at, what, $294 or something like that in terms of fair market value, to give you an idea how that translates. So that concludes Jeopardy. So who are our contestants for Final Jeopardy? I think we had 4. So the next... Actually, I don't have a Final Jeopardy question, sorry. So what are we going to do between now and June when we present the final budget adoption? Well, we are going to go through every line item, review all the revenues and expenses. We've had meetings with all the department administrators. We had those back in December. We're going to have second meetings now to refine, cut, streamline the budget even further. An important piece of next year's budget, too, is the 10-year capital plan prioritization, because that will have an impact on the amount of money transferred to the capital reserve fund for the upcoming year. And that's going to be handled starting in January, February, March, in the Facilities and Operations Committee prioritization. Staffing recommendations, again, that's going to be a big item. We'll also present, probably within the next month or two, perhaps in one of our special finance committee meetings, our 5-year budget projections, because we want to look at things on a future scale approach. You can't look at a budget 1 year in isolation. You have to ask yourself, what impact are my decisions that I make today going to have on future years? And obviously, the more years you go out, you have to make more assumptions, and those assumptions tend to be less accurate the more years you go out. But we can always debate and have conversation about what those assumptions look like. And again, to reiterate for the 10th time, as we get more information, we constantly update the budget. New information comes in, we update it. We have been in a holding pattern since we developed the budget in mid-December. We didn't want to make any changes because we did post the document to the website in case anyone had looked at it. We do always have that right to make amendments, but we thought between mid-December and mid-January, we'll just keep things as they are and hold in our hip pocket any changes that we're aware of, and we'll make them for the next iteration of the budget. So what we're asking for tonight, to sum things up, is our first look at the budget. January 16th, we'll be asking, well, tonight we're asking for your approval to place the preliminary budget on the January 16th action meeting for approval. What we'll have on January 16th then is the approval of the preliminary budget. We'll then need to submit the document to the Department of Education. Then also consideration of application for the referendum exception, the special ed exception. Our recommendation would be to apply for the exception, and then you can decide at a later time whether you want to utilize the exception or not. It gives the board an additional option as part of the budget balancing strategy. So we ask for your approval to have the preliminary budget on the January 16th action agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Skoraki, for that thorough, educational, and entertaining budget presentation. Can I have a motion then to move the preliminary budget to the January 16th action meeting? Any other questions?
I have one, just a question, not necessarily pertaining to this, but to the presentation. Mr. Skoraki, is there a standard that you use or that we can explore in terms of setting, I think it's important for the community to understand what the inequitable funding means to North Penn. It's my understanding, through research last year, it was somewhere around $7.5, $7.7 million that the district did not receive. And that number only goes up each year. I'd really like that, if you feel it's solid information, I think it's very important for informing the community dialogue about the budget.
Yeah, well, I'm planning on probably in either February or March, there'll be a separate agenda item on revenues. And part of that is going to be discussion about our state funding. And I think what you're referencing, Mr. Casa, is the basic education funding formula. Because right now that formula is only being applied to new dollars that are generated. Had the formula been applied to all dollars, that would actually be very, very beneficial for North Penn School District, to the tune of several $million in additional state subsidy. So we are a benefactor of that new formula. The only problem is it's prospective, it's not retroactive.
I think, the larger goal, from my perspective as one board member in educating the board on policy, as we interact with the community, I think it's helpful when we have that slide about the charter school funding and what that means. It's a simple formula. Unfunded mandates, $290,000 in tech security that has to be dealt with. Those issues we need to really make plain so the community understands that. And I think, all these numbers add up. And it's our job to tell that story simply to the community. Thank you.
Just to follow up on that, when I was looking at the budget, I said to myself, how much of the benefits were going to people on retirement, people on retirement, and the other thing is, the other cost is special education needs. Those costs really aren't broken out in our budget, and maybe that isn't the place to break those items out. But it would be, from a public standpoint, that would be very nice for the public to know. And so when we go back with the big tax increase for the public, if we need one, we can explain to them this is why we're doing it.
Yeah, we'll break all that down. We have one really good chart I know we shared last year to show the gap between the special education costs and the special education funding over the past couple of years. And that gap continues to grow. I think our special education increase over the past couple of years has been like 1.5%. And you heard me mention earlier that our costs are growing at 6-7%. Again, that's not a sustainable formula. That gap just continues to grow. That's not a North Penn gap. That's every school district throughout the Commonwealth.
I want to move this along, but I do actually have one other question. I noticed that in your assumptions, you had for the federal revenue, it's 0%. It's typically 1%. Is that just overly conservative, or is there some reason that you feel that the federal government is going to be providing us nothing this year?
No, I think just being overly conservative.
Just overly conservative,
Yeah, I mean, in
okay.
fact, we made that decision in early December. I think subsequent to that, there's been some news and information that would indicate that perhaps we could have maybe a larger increase in the upcoming year than what we've previously experienced.
That would be nice.
But keep in mind that federal is like less
I know it's
than
1%, but still,
right,
I
yeah.
was almost
take
more
it.
of a policy sort of question more than anything. I know we're not highly dependent on that, but 0 is 0. Okay, in that case, all in favor of moving the budget to action, say aye. Aye. Oh. So moved. All right, we're going to move on to budget transfers, if that's what you want to do next, Mr. Skoraki.
Okay, budget transfers. We have majority of the transfers that are listed, and we're asking for your approval to move these to the January 16th meeting are due to account code changes. That was the same case last month as well. We're asking to place this on the agenda, and the total amount is $338,061. So again, a budget transfer means that you're just basically moving money from one budgeted line item to another budgeted line item, and the majority of these are because of account code changes.
Can I have a motion to move the budget transfers to the action meeting agenda?
So moved. Second.
Thoughts, questions? All in favor? Aye. All right, so moved. And our next item is the School Nutrition Services Grant Award.
Okay. Next item we received information a couple weeks ago that we have successfully received two $5,000 grants in school nutrition services. These are to buy breakfast carts at Oak Park and at Knapp Elementary School. We actually received the same grant 2 years ago, $5,000 each for breakfast carts, and we have them at the high school and at Penndale Middle School. I did attach some pictures and board docs, so thank you to our School Nutrition Services Coordinator, Melissa Froelich, for applying for the grant. Typically what we do for grants is we have the board accept the grant. In this particular case, the $5,000 completely covers the cost of the grant, so there's no district portion, no district funding here. But as practice, we do have the district, the board accept the grant. And I'm going to refer to JoJo because hopefully you've seen the breakfast cart at the high school. Any comments you want to make about that? Have you ever purchased any food at the breakfast cart at the high school?
Yeah, so every time I walk in the morning, there's always a big line, and it's definitely worth standing in because I get food sometimes, and it's definitely worth skipping the time from traveling all the way down to the cafeteria and then coming back to like all the way to K-Pod, for example. So having the breakfast cart out in the open lobby is definitely a good improvement in terms of making food accessible in different parts of the school.
Yeah, and that's the exact goal here, that, and time is an issue. So for a student to go to the cafeteria, many times, depending on when they get off the bus, they're pressed for time. So to have it right there, basically as soon as the student walks in the building, our objective is to get more students have food in their bellies before they start the day. And the data we have, both for the high school and Penndale, the amount of additional breakfasts that we've served as a result of those carts is absolutely awesome.
Who is the grant from?
This is a Pennsylvania Department of Education, yes,
And do we just have one at the high school?
just one.
Okay. And is it, JoJo, is it at the front lobby? Is that where they have it, at the front lobby?
I'm sorry.
How much is the cart if you buy it?
Well, I think the portion, the actual cart itself is about $4,200. And then the other portion of it is for software, to have the point-of-sale software system and register right there at the cart. So I think that's a breakdown. It's like $4,200 for the cart, $800 for the computer-related technology.
And then the staffing.
And the staffing, right. And the staffing, there are some additional staffing expenses. That's borne by School Nutrition Services, but the revenue generated from the breakfast sales way more than offsets the additional staff hours.
I'm just thinking that specifically at the high school, thank you for bringing that to light, because I think as neighboring districts are looking at the sleep studies and everything, and the time that our kids are arriving at the high school, I mean, some of them as early as 5 a.m. They're not eating breakfast. So, I mean, I would love to see more than one cart at the high school, frankly, because I think you bring up a very good point that our kids are just walking in and they're not eating. Some of them are getting on the bus at 6 in the morning, or arriving there for practice at 5:30. So I do think that might be something I would be interested at some point when she's maybe presenting her budget and learning more about the food carts and how we could maybe support that moving forward, because you're talking about $4,000, which is a drop in the bucket when you talk about the well-being of our students. So thank you, JoJo, for that information.
What's interesting about School Nutrition Services, so again, this is what we call an enterprise fund. So separate from the general fund that's funded by tax dollars, the goal of the enterprise fund is to be self-supporting. And there's always a fine line, because you don't want to have, just like with the fund balance, you don't want to have too much money in reserve, but you want to have enough money in case there's emergencies. Well, Pennsylvania Department of Education actually has like a maximum percent, sort of like our unassigned fund balance. There's also a max percent for food service, and we're getting to the point where we need to start spending some money. in school nutrition services, and we have been replacing a lot of equipment. So I'll ask Melissa, as part of her discussion, maybe we can take a look at expanding the breakfast cart program throughout a number of other buildings, and maybe even a second one at the high school, because I can tell you there's money. I don't want to be spending, Melissa's money, but there's money available in school nutrition services. They have a very, very healthy fund balance.
When you think of the number of students that walk through the door at the high school, I think that at least one more would be something that we should consider. The number of kids that are staying after school and, I know the breakfast cart doesn't work for after school, but, they're there for a very long day. So they're getting there at 6, some of them are leaving at 7, so it'd be great if they put that up.
It's an awesome program, and Melissa was even invited to a national conference to present on this topic. So it's really been beneficial for the students, it's been beneficial for the school nutrition services program, and the fact that it was recognized and selected through a competitive process to present at a national conference, I think speaks well.
All right. Kind of a motion to move the School Nutrition Services Grant Award to the action meeting. Any more thoughts? All in favor? Aye. All right, so moved. Let's go to informational items.
Okay, information items. I mentioned about our first look healthcare rates, 0% increase when you net out the medical and the prescription. And we'll get our second look rates in February, but again, we don't expect it to be any increase, a 0% increase. We are a member of what's called CPAST, the Southeast Pennsylvania Insurance Trust. This is for our medical and prescription. Dr. Dietrich serves on the executive committee. He's the superintendent representative of the members, and we're up to, what, Dr. Dietrich, 17 members, I think? 17 members in CPAST right now. So we're proud to be part of that organization, and we really like the results that we were able to achieve in the last 2 years, with 2 consecutive years with 0% with healthcare. And we actually have a nice balance on the books as well. So I mentioned when we talked about fund balance, we have $2.7 million in fund balance for our self-insurance fund. With the balance that we have with the IU program right now, that's another conversation we have, if we need to have that $2.7 million carved out or not. Maybe a smaller portion would be okay. But we'll give you an update in February. I just don't expect any increase at all based on what the trends are. Moving on, if I could, Mr. Fusco, I'd like to save the rebate program for the end. I do have a short presentation on that. I'll breeze through the other ones. As part of the budget process, we do have the department administrators come in and do a presentation on their departmental level budgets. And for the benefit of our new board members, one of the things we're going to do is also include a departmental overview. So our administrators are going to spend some time and talk about what makes up their department, who are some of the key staff members in the department, what services are provided by that department. So they'll cover that first, kind of like an orientation to each department within the school district, and then they'll get into some of the specifics about what's driving their budget for the upcoming year. So we have transportation, facilities and operations, and school and community engagement on February 3rd. On the 11th, we have curriculum, special ed, elementary ed, and secondary ed. And in March, we have human resources, school safety, and we have technology. So that gives the board an opportunity to start now breaking down that $280 million into smaller increments. Okay, and they talk about major areas of changes in their budget and what's important in their budget. Questions about that schedule? Okay. Moving on to retirement, I mentioned this earlier as well. Our retirement rate for next year will be 34.51%. It was less than what was projected the previous year, and that's a reflection of the nice returns in the stock market in particular over the past year, and that lower rate saved us about $175,000 in next year's budget net of the subsidy. So good news with the retirement. Questions about that? All right, moving on to propane bus purchase. Back in November, we had the board approve the advertisement for bid to buy 7 additional 83-passenger propane buses. It's in the grant for the year, it's in the budget for the current fiscal year, and we did also apply for a grant. We're still waiting to hear back from that. That's through the Environmental Protection Agency. That would be $20,000 a bus. But the board did give us authorization to proceed to advertise to bid to buy 7 additional buses. Well, in the meantime, we've learned that there's only one bus manufacturer for the 83 passenger bus, and this is what we desire to purchase. And that bus manufacturer is Brightbill. Bluebird, it's resold by Brightbill. So, in our most recent bus purchases through the competitive bid process, they were also Bluebird buses. So we kind of view the situation right now as pointless to spend the advertising cost and the labor to write a bid specification when there's only going to be one bidder. There's only one propane bus manufacturer that does the 83 passenger bus. So Thomas and International are the two other bus manufacturers. They do not manufacture an 83 passenger propane bus at the present time. So our dilemma was we still have state purchasing guidelines that we need to adhere to, but we thought it would be just a complete waste of time and money to do a bid when you know you're only get one response. So we did find a purchasing consortium that does meet our state's purchasing requirements for bidding, and that's through an organization, a purchasing consortium called Sourcewell. So I bring it to your attention tonight for information. The purchase is already in the budget, but I just want to let you know that our recommendation is not to bid, not to waste the money on the advertisement, simply buy the buses through the Sourcewell Purchasing Consortium. And what we did is we went back and looked at, okay, well, what's their Sourcewell pricing compared to what our bid pricing was? We went back and looked at the pricing from our last bid for the 78 passenger busing, and it was $110 difference per bus. So our recommendation is proceed with the Sourcewell contract and buy the 83 passenger buses from that contract and avoid the bid, knowing that Bluebird, Brightbill would be the only bidder submitting a bid. Any concerns or questions about that? Okay. Last item are, we have the financial reports. I have those summarized. For our new board members too, for the financial reports, when you're in board docs, I include a summary under executive content. So that's not viewed by the public, that's for your information. Sometimes I put some subjective commentary in there for your review, but I do summarize each report. I try to do that about a week before the board meeting, so that way when we come to the finance meeting, we don't spend time necessarily covering every report. There was a period of time where we went through laboriously every report after report after report. I recall one meeting, it was 2 hours into the meeting, and we were just finishing the reports and then starting the agenda. So I try to summarize those reports prior to the meeting, and that way feel free, if you have any questions about the summary, reach out either prior to the meeting or at the meeting if you have any questions. But typically the financial reports, we don't spend a lot of time at the Finance Committee meeting covering them, since I have them summarized under executive content. One report I do want to mention, we have a monthly report in there for right-to-know requests, and we have a link in there under executive content. If you click on there, you'll see all the right-to-know requests that we received so far this year. And I do want to let you know that both the volume and the sophistication of those right-to-know requests are increasing. And that's continuing to be a further drain on our internal resources. So when we talk about unfunded mandates, we can throw that into the list, because when we respond to a right-to-know request, we cannot charge back any of the labor or the legal review or any of the time for that right-to-know request. And we've had some requests that were so intensive this year that required review of several thousand pages of documentation before we could respond, both internally and with legal. And again, none of that time can be charged back. So I just want to bring that to your attention that, from a policy standpoint and a legislative standpoint, I think right to know is another area that might be ripe for some reform. I'm all for transparency. There needs to be a limit. Sometimes we get requests from marketing companies that want our data that they can use for marketing purposes. From Florida, there's one company in particular, and it just doesn't feel right when we're incurring staff time to respond to those requests. All right, the last item tonight is a presentation on our rebate program for next year. Tax rebate program. It's time to start thinking about what that. It's time to start thinking about what the rebate program might look like for next year. So tonight we're just presenting some of this information for consideration. We'll bring it back at a later meeting for your consideration. But I do have some data tonight just to plant some seeds with with the committee to determine what we might look at for next year. I just want to cover a real brief overview of what the program looks like and some of the data that we've already experienced in the second year of our program. So our tax rebate program here at North Penn School District is modeled after the Pennsylvania program. The Pennsylvania program is called the PA Property Tax Rent Rebate Program. It's administered by the Pennsylvania Department of Revenue, and it's funded by lottery and slot proceeds. Individuals are eligible based on their income, and there is an income limit of $35,000 and a lower limit if you're a renter. And the eligibility is threefold. If you're age 65 or older, you're eligible, a widow or widower age 50 or older, or permanently disabled and over the age of 18. I can tell you that the vast majority of those that are eligible fit into the first category, age 65 or older. That's probably 95% of those that are eligible fit into the first category. So the program works like this. The maximum rebate that a household can receive from the state is $650. But they also offer what are called supplemental rebates. So if an individual pays a large amount of property taxes relative to their income level, they can qualify for a supplemental rebate. So it's an additional boost to the $650. The maximum amount that anyone can receive from the state is $975. That's the maximum they can receive from the state. And the income level includes all income, so capital gains, rental income, that's included. Social Security, 1/2 of that is counted. Wage income is counted at 100%. So the sliding scale looks like this. Again, this is at the state level. So if you're between $0 and $8,000, you're eligible for $650 before the supplements. If you're in the $18,000 to $35,000 income level, you're eligible for $250. So the more you make, the less you're eligible for from the state. Renters only have 2 categories of income, not 4, and it's capped at $15,000. 0 to 8 is the same $650, and 8,000 to 15,000 is the same $500. But it caps renters at $15,000. So North Penn program is in its second year of existence in the 1920 year, and we piggyback off of that state program. So if an individual applied at the state for a rebate and received a state rebate, they're eligible here at North Penn School District. So we simply piggyback off all the documentation that was submitted to the state. And this year, in the second year of the program, we did expand the program to include renters. The first year, only homeowners were eligible. The second year, we included renters. So renters are now receiving rebates not only from the state, but from North Penn School District. And the way an individual can receive a rebate from North Penn is simply complete a 1-page application, provide proof that they submitted an application to the state, and provide proof that they received a rebate from the state. It's a pretty simple process. We try to keep it as simple as possible, and I think individuals are able to complete the application with little or no assistance. So at North Penn School District, right now this year, we will provide a 30% match of the state program. So if somebody received $100 from the state, you're eligible to receive 30% of that from North Penn School District. The only stipulation is you cannot exceed 100% of taxes paid. So if that 30% would put you over the total amount of taxes you paid, there's no windfall here. We would reimburse up to 100% of the taxes paid. So our maximum rebate is $195. $195. It's 30% of the $650 maximum at the state. We don't include any supplements in our rebates. So max is $195. Homeowners are eligible, renters are eligible, and we have this third category that's eligible we called hybrid individuals, hybrid property owners. So hybrid owners are those individuals that might own a mobile home. They own the manufactured home, but they rent the land on which it sits. Those are hybrid property owners. So they have a combination rent, they have a combination property owners. That was addressed in the second year of the program. Those individuals are eligible also.
Mr. Scrocky,
Yes.
before you go any further, just want to, a couple numbers are going around in my head here. The maximum rebate, obviously those who are in the most financial need, can qualify for up to $195.
From North Penn.
From
yes.
North Penn.
Yep.
Specifically from North Penn. So when we were looking at the preliminary budget table, and we looked at the worst case scenario, being taking the full Act 1 exemptions, a $150,000 homestead which approximately is probably a home worth about $300,000, correct?
Correct.
They would be looking at a tax burden of approximately $140, is that correct?
Let me bring that up.
My point being, it's less than 190, so it is safe to draw an assumption that those who are in most need, who qualify for this, are likely to have the tax increase, whatever it is, negated by this program. Is that correct?
Correct, yep.
I think that's an important point to drive home, is that,
$138 increase for the maximum amount that could be levied.
that when we have that discussion about tax increases and we hear from people that communicate about those in the community who are most vulnerable and least able to make that contribution to our district, that this program is specifically targeting those people and in a way that can best address that specific concern, that those increases, which unfortunately are necessary, if for no other reason than inflation, that we are trying to do something to help those that we recognize need the help the most in this community.
Well said. Okay, the couple other quick highlights about the program. The rebate program here in North Penn did receive the PASBO Award of Achievement in the past year. And as a result of that, we had 3 graduating seniors last year, each receive a $1,000 scholarship. So that was great that some of the recognition from the program, some of our students, they were able to benefit from that. Also, there was a Philadelphia Inquirer article back in September or October, and I forget now if it was Mr. Casa or Mrs. Stoll that helped broker that article, but thank you for that. Mr. Casa, that generated a lot of additional interest, so that was an excellent article. I'll show you a snapshot of that in a second. But word is spreading because we've been invited and have presented already now at the PASBO, that's the Pennsylvania Association of School Business Officials. They had a tax symposium back in October, so we presented there. We also presented at the Delaware Valley Association of School Business Officials. That was also, I believe, in September at the fall workshops. 2 districts have already implemented the program based on North Penn's work, and we've been contacted, and there's interest in 6 other school districts. And a lot of that was because of this article. Here's a snapshot from the online edition of the Philadelphia Inquirer that was in September 7th, 2019. I like the heading. It's a Monco School District. We created a tax relief program that others want to copy. So 2 have already copied, and 6 are in various stages of copying. And we like that because we think it's a good program that can help deliver assistance to those that are most needy in lieu of any kind of statewide property tax relief. So in terms of budget numbers for our 19-20 year, we budgeted $142,000. The first year we budgeted, I think it was roughly $116,000, so we did increase the budget for 2 reasons. Number one, we thought as word spreads, more people will apply. And secondly, we increased the rebate from 20% to 30% from year 1 to year 2. Also, we assume 50% of those that are eligible would apply this year. 50%. We probably won't reach that target, but that's something that we actually were hoping would happen. Right now, we're probably only looking at about 40% of those eligible actually applying. So we won't spend that entire $142,000. Year to date, we had...
Mr. Skaraki?
Yes.
So is it our responsibility to get the word out to them, to encourage them to apply?
We try as much as possible. We have direct contact with all of our local representatives at the Senate level and the House level locally here. We have applications in their hands. So a lot of times when individuals apply at the state level, they'll go to their local legislative offices to apply for the state rebate program. And now every office has been trained to hand over a North Penn application when they apply at the state level. So that's one great way of getting the word out. We've also had at least 3 or 4 board, I don't want to call it interventions. That doesn't sound.
It's an intervention.
We've had breakfast.
Breakfasts.
Yeah,
Breakfasts.
we go
Breakfast
out.
interventions.
Yeah, we went out to several communities. I think 4 or 5 times over the last 2 years, and we hosted breakfasts and brought them the information. It was various school board directors that went. So, and it's fun. It's a good way for us to get to know our constituents and to spread the word on a good program.
Right, and we've even had board directors go out and hand-deliver checks to recipients,
Yeah.
so, yes.
I think that's
the answer
been
is
one of the best forms of outreach, is being able to hand over the check to somebody who has applied, you know, and many times we're learning that their accountant knew about the program and helped them, or that they had gone to their state rep's office. And then we're also able to share information with them and ask them to help spread the word. So I've had that where I've given out my business, the board business card as I delivered the check, and they've had people call me to then direct them back to where to go. So we're doing everything we can. I think a lot of it is just because this is year 2 of the program. It involves something that none of us like to do, which is our taxes, and it's all part of that process enrolled within it. So I think that having a steady effort to continue the outreach for the first 5 years of the program, so to continue to do the breakfast, continue to do outreach to our local elected officials is something that we are all committed to doing.
Mr. Skoraki, that assumed 50% was the budgeted amount, was we assumed at 50%?
Correct.
But 40% is actually pretty good, I mean, relative to the year before. Am I correct, like in terms of what we budgeted and what we actually, like our
Yes.
presumption of what we would get versus what we did get? That looks much healthier than it was in the first
Yes.
year.
Our applications are definitely up this year. I think last year we finished, it was roughly about 30% of those that were eligible applied. This year, we're looking at about a 10 percentage point increase. Yep, definitely up. So $39,000 in rebates so far this year, 370 applicants. So that's a nice increase from what we've had the current year. I find this really interesting. This is the 3 category, the breakdown that I mentioned earlier. We have renters, we have hybrid, and we have owners. So the percent of applications, we've only had 7% of all the applications came from renters, 16% hybrid, 76% owners. But when you look at the rebate amounts, the rebates are a lot higher for the renters. So that would be an argument that those are the individuals that are most in need because their income levels are lower, therefore they're eligible for a higher rebate in general compared to the owners. Then hybrid right in the middle. I was hoping for a larger number of renters, since I think that was a nice addition the board made this past year, but only 7% of the applications so far have been renters. So if there's one outreach area that maybe we need to focus on, perhaps it's the renters. Maybe it's meeting with property management groups or the property manager at that particular complex, but maybe getting the word out to renters a little bit more than what we've done might be helpful.
Do you know, does that in any way parity what the state numbers look like for renters?
I'll show you that in a second.
Okay, all right, good.
And while you're pulling that up, I think there's looking at, if we look at our community where the renters are living, some of them are in larger apartment complexes where there might be that property management, but some of them are living in smaller single apartments. So I think one place of outreach which is on my to-do list to reach out to is I think the Peak Center has a contact with a lot of those individuals. But I think that the Peak Center has been one of our primary sources for submission of
Assistance,
those.
yes, they've been very, very helpful.
Okay.
They're very familiar with the program.
I think reaching out to some community-based organizations to help identify where these individuals who truly are in need may be over a property management company might be a good option and a good place to look as our next focus of outreach.
We might also want to look at, since the NAACP is looking to work with us, seeing if they can help spread the word as well.
We can't get that information from the state, of the people who got the rebate.
We have aggregate data. I'll share that in a second, but we don't have specific identifiable data.
Oh, okay,
We have de-identified aggregate data, that's it.
okay, and that will tell us how large this rebate could actually get.
Correct, yep. So a couple considerations for the 2021 program. Some of the things that were discussed last year, number one could be the 30%. Should the 30% be increased? And I'll show a couple scenarios in a second. Another consideration I threw out there was, should rebates include these supplements? So I mentioned the supplements could take the rebate at the state level up to $975. So again, the supplements are driven for those individuals that meet the income guideline, but then also they pay a high percent of their total income in property tax. So if somebody's income on the application is $20,000 and they have a $5,000 property tax bill, in all likelihood, they're getting the supplement. So that would be a consideration to include the supplements, or perhaps that's something for a future year. when we started the program, one of the things we said was we can start small and we can always ratchet things up year after year depending on how the program succeeds. Those are two items for consideration. So some of the data that I wanted to share, this is the most recent data available at the state level. Now this is specific for the North Penn community. So they're able to break it down by school district community, showing the number of rebates and the total state rebate. So for owners, 1,572 owners received a rebate in 2017, $500,000 in state rebates. So 1,500, that's pales in comparison to, we've had 370 applicants, 76% of those were owners. So let's say, 300 owners applied here at North Penn? There's 1,500 individuals out there somewhere. So we need to, keep working on getting that number up. We think we're going to get close to 40% just based on where the trend is now, but we have a lot of room, I think, to grow with that. So 1,500 claimants, $527,000 in rebates. For renters, it's about half the number of claimants. Again, there's only 2 income tiers, 774, so about half the applicants, but the dollar difference isn't that much of a difference. So it shows you that, again, just like we experienced, the average rebate check is higher for renters. Here the state seems to be, when you put it on a per claimant basis, renters are receiving a higher rebate amount than property owners are. Very similar to what we've experienced.
Can we make the assumption that the people who are getting the $650 rebate are the people who are getting the supplements?
Not necessarily, because I've seen, since I see all the applications, I've seen people in that highest income tier of $18,000 to $35,000 receive the supplements.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it really just depends on what proportion their real estate taxes are to their income. So if somebody has that $20,000 income on the application and that $4,000 or $5,000 property tax, they're receiving a supplement. If you're at the $35,000 income level, unless your property taxes are probably $6,000, $7,000 a year, you're probably not receiving a supplement. So for budgetary purposes for the upcoming year, one of the discussion points we need to have, it deals with what percentage the rebate should be, and that'll drive out a certain budget amount. So for next year, if the rebate was kept basically at 30%, the exact same program we have now, it would be roughly the same budget figure for next year, $141,000. If the rebate would go to 40%, it would be $188,000 budget figure. 50% would be $235,000. So again, this assumes a participation rate based on that state data of 50%. So can we get it to 50% next year? I don't know. I would like to say we could. So the budget figures are probably very conservative. They're probably on the high side. But if the program was kept the same, we wouldn't need to change anything with the budget. And right now, Kristen, I believe we have the exact amount in, right, of roughly $141,000 in the budget for next year. So any change to that, any increase to that, we would have to increase the budget amount for the upcoming year, assuming a 50% participation rate for the upcoming year. So again, this is for consideration for you to ponder. We're in January. Ideally, we would like to have the program approved for the 2021 year, either in February or March, because a lot of individuals start applying for the state rebate in February and March when they do their income tax return. A lot of times they take care of everything at once, and if we can put the application in the hands of the local legislative offices, again, when they do the state rebate, they get the North Penn form, they can take care of everything all at once for the upcoming year.
Mr. Scrocky, is there a chart you could put together or some details on the supplemental? Because my feeling is, at least now, is that that's a bit of a wild card compared to the data you have now for your projections.
Yes.
So is it going to remain a wild card, or is there something that we're able to at least base our assumptions on?
The state does have some supplemental data, so I'll provide that next meeting. Yeah. And then we can throw that into the mix here and see how that moves the needle with respect to the budget. Other feedback, thoughts?
Would adding the supplementals make it more complicated for the business office to approve 'em, or is it just if you qualify for the supplemental at the state level, then you qualify for the supplemental at the?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah, but it'll be easy.
all right.
Unless we do some variation like, well, if you get the supplemental, if you get the base, you're eligible for 30%, but if you get the supplemental, now it's 15% of the then it gets,
We want to keep it simple.
I mean, it's not high math, but it's more processing time.
Right.
And we're trying to simplify the processing time so it's not onerous on the approver, me, and our accounts payable person. I mean, they're processing the checks, but
Right.
the more we can streamline the approval process and simplify it, I would recommend that.
Okay.
So if we do consider supplements, to keep it the same percent as the base amount.
Right, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Oh, I have
The-
one other item relative to this. As board secretary, I'll read this because for the second straight year, not often does a board receive a thank you note. This was addressed in North Penn School District Board of Directors. You received a thank you note as pertaining to this program. It was the same lovely individual that sent the note last year. So this is awesome. This is dated December 27th, 2019. To all the North Penn School Board members, again, I wish to thank you for the tax rebate refund you gave me. It is a wonderful thing. It allows for something special or extra I might not have a chance to have. Thanks again. Happy New Year. Jacqueline Ruth. So thank you on behalf of Jacqueline for the
Yeah,
program.
thank you, Ms. Ruth. Always nice to get a thank you.
Can we send a response?
We'll show her tour with breakfast.
I
Yeah,
think that that's the next step. I think that that's the wise, yes.
Right.
yeah, right, yeah.
With a bouquet of flowers, maybe. That was lovely.
Okay, financial reports?
No other update unless there's any questions. You've heard me mention before about the concern with interest income. We probably won't reach our budget figure for the upcoming year. Earned income tax, I was worried a little bit earlier in the year, but now we're a little bit above 3.5% growth in our earned income tax receipts, which is good. We've had pretty strong income with respect to our housing sales, our property sales through the realty transfer tax. So that's been good. So other than the lower interest income because of the 3 Federal Reserve cuts this fiscal year, our other local sources of revenue seem to be pretty good. It'll be interesting. This week and next week, our local elected tax collectors bring in all the unpaid properties to us. And this will actually be an agenda item coming up where the board ratifies the delinquent properties. So always take a look at that as a leading indicator too, an economic indicator. We always compare the number of delinquent properties both in quantity and dollar amount each year to see how that compared to previous years. So we'll have that information in an upcoming, but they're starting to come in now, the delinquent reports from our elected tax collectors.
All right, thank you, Mr. Scrocky. There's clearly not going to be any public comment. Do we have any other business? Is that even on here? No? All right, then to summarize action items that are moving to action, the 2020 preliminary budget was voted to move to action, as were budget transfers from December 1st through December 31st, and the School Nutrition Services Grant Award. Without anything else, can I have a motion to adjourn? Right, we're adjourned.
Thank you.